Okay, I want to welcome everyone here to chapter 5 of the book of Joshua, and we'll begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commands and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. All right, then. Before we get going, are there any? Here we are on this this first little area, chapter 1 through 5, and here we are in the consecration phase of it. And again, our map of showing kind of where things were taking place, and you can see right down here in the right above the Dead Sea is where they were at the time. Okay, so are there any comments or questions from last week that anyone may have had before we get cranking in on this thing?
I have kind of a question that's off topic a bit.
Okay.
Would it be okay if I send an invite to a friend of mine?
Absolutely, sure.
All right, I'll be back in a minute.
Okay. Yeah, that's something. If tell anybody and everybody if they wanted to get in on this, it'd be great. No problem. So anyway, let's go ahead and recap the the last couple of chapters. We've been getting ready. Last week we finally crossed the Jordan River, and then they set up memorial stones on one side of the river, and then they had memorial stones in the midst, what the Bible says, in the midst of the river. But in the midst could also, we explained last week, could also meant that over there where the high priest had stepped into the water, and basically they were on the water's edge at flood stage, so they put up these big markers. So then when the river went back down, they could actually see markers on both sides of the river where the Israelites had crossed over. So now this particular chapter, it's kind of broken up. It's there's like 4 tokens or 4 themes or something in this chapter, and the first one is the token of circumcision, which is the covenant, getting back into covenant favor. And then the second one being the blood, which a token of blood, which is the anticipation of deliverance. And then the fruit is the appropriation of the blessing, and we'll go through each one of these things as we go through. Then finally the sword, which is going to be the part of where we normally think of Joshua being, going through it with the sword and conquering the land. So God had guaranteed Joshua's successes only to the extent that he kept the Mosaic law. And it was therefore necessary for all the males who had been born in the wilderness, who had not undergone circumcision, then that they should do that now. And circumcision brought each male into the blessing of the Abrahamic covenant. And so this rite, or the commandment to be circumcised, was also a prerequisite for partaking in the Passover. God required of all Israelites, he said that they should be doing that every year. So for them to partake in the Passover, they were supposed to be circumcised. So the question came up last week or week before: did the Israelites do a Passover while they were in the desert? And I came up with, I don't believe they did, because of this requirement to be circumcised prior to doing the Passover, and so if they were not circumcised, then they could not very well participate in the Passover. So, but this circumcision, the idea of circumcision was like the stones that they set up. It was a memorial. It was a marker. All right. So let's look at the first verse there. Now it came about when all the Amorite kings beyond the Jordan westward, and all the Canaanite kings by the sea heard how Adonai had dried up the waters of the Jordan before Bnei Israel, until they had crossed, their hearts melted, nor was there any spirit in them anymore because of Bnei Israel. All right. So now this verse, I'm going to just kind of show you where the king of the Amorites are right here, and then the Canaanites here, and that's, you still got the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and so forth. All those guys, all those ites down there. So this first verse, you'd think that it may be a little bit more appropriate to be the conclusion of the chapter, but this explains why the Israelites were able to take several days to perform the circumcision operation, and that basically would have rendered their entire army vulnerable, militarily speaking. And so Israel's foes feared them very, very greatly, and as a result, they just kind of hunkered down in place and didn't go out to meet the Israelites in battle. And it said that their heart melted in them. And so that, I don't know, I just get the idea of a great big old big chunk of Hershey's Kisses or something, that you get it hot and it just goes like that. And so these guys says their hearts melted. Now the reference to the Amorites and the Canaanites, they group all of those together. It's because it encompasses the people of the high areas and the plains, and the Canaanites were principally just merchants and traders. They really weren't warriors. They were not a warrior clan, but the Amorites were. What the Canaanites didn't do as far as being warriors, the Amorites made up for it in spades. So basically, when they say the Canaanites and the Amorites, that kind of put everybody in the same collective, I guess you would say. That's all of those other tribes were ethnically either kind of part of the Amorites and or part of the Canaanites, and so they whoever wrote the book of Joshua, if it was Joshua himself, they put them together and put all these people together. So he put the native peoples, one of the groups, together, and so that there were some in the south and the north and the highlands and the lowlands and everything in between. So one commentator said that this reference to the Amorites and the Canaanites was probably a thing called merism, which is a figure of speech in that the two extremes of things represent the whole. An example of that would mean that heaven and earth would mean the universe. So, if that makes any sense. So they would just say the Amorites and the Canaanites to mean everybody there in Canaan. So, all right. Let's go on. Are there any questions on that so far? All righty then. Verses 2 and 3. At that time, Adonai said to Joshua, "Make yourself flint knives and circumcise again Bnei Israel a second time. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised Bnei Israel at Gibeath Ha-Araloth. Okay, now flint knives. Why in the world? Oh my goodness, a cartoon jumped in here. All right, I'll give you a second to look at it. And if you can't look at it, oh yeah, some of you are on telephones. All right, the cartoon has got one guy looking at another guy and says, "Hey Joshua, I've assembled all the men of Israel like you said. Now what? Why are you holding that funny looking knife?" And then they got two little characters down at the bottom of them that's in each and every one of the cartoons that this guy draws. And there's a woman says, "I bet that wasn't in the brochure for the promised land." And then another guy has got sweat beating off of him and says, "Uh-oh." So anyway, that's kind of like the one I showed you where Moses was telling the people, and or Moses was talking to God, and he says, "Wait a minute, you want us to cut the tip off of our what?" And so, or not Moses, Abraham. So anyway, flint knives. Getting back to the flint knives, they were sharp flint rocks, and they're very sharp. In fact, I've read some stuff about knives and where the native or the indigenous people in various places were still using flint knives, and the reason for it was that they were sharper. They could get those things sharper than what they could get metal knives. Now, they had been using, this was the Bronze Age. This took place in the late Bronze Age, and there's some examples of some flint knives that have survived through the ages. And if you get a dull blade on it, you just take and chip off the other one. So, all right, now Richard posted a chat thing here. Says he's quoting Amos 2:9. Says, "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was as strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath." So there again, that was a comment by God to Amos that, hey, the Amorites couldn't stand before me. All right. Little comment on flint knives. They are sharpened by chipping away at the edge of the stone, with just chip, and so that you get a clean knife edge there, and bacteria and viruses wouldn't grow on the rock. So circumcision was actually performed with these things as an instrument. It had some, I don't know if it was like something that we would have today with, that had been in the autoclave, but they were pretty sterile as things went back in those days. So I would imagine that that the likelihood of infection following something like that back in those days would have been high. So, and Pat said also you could take those knives and bake them in the sun, and that would help reduce any kind of little beasties that would be on the knife itself. So in this case, it was kind of interesting that God would say, okay, I know you guys have got these modern bronze knives now and so forth, but I want you to go back to the old ways and do it with the flint. Now, the word for flint, it was used one other time in the Torah, and the word for flint is sword, and the transliteration of it was be tsor, and it occurs one other time in the Old Testament. That's where Zipporah was talking to Moses about circumcising their sons, and that's the only other time that particular word is used in the Old Testament. But by God telling him to use these things, here it was. He turned from the ultimate healer to, in this case, the ultimate preventer of disease and infection. So, any comments, questions? Okay. And it said that that they were to circumcise again a second time. So we're looking at that and say, okay, well, when was the other time? When was the first time? And it said that actually the Bible doesn't say. It doesn't tell them when that other circumcision was, but it had to have been at a time before Israel left Egypt, and I think probably a time, perhaps it was before they had their little their meal, their Passover meal, for the very first Passover meal, and so. Also, it said that they threw all this stuff out at the foreskins. They took them and threw them in a big heap, and so they call that place Gibeath HaAraloth, which literally means a hill of foreskins. And so it's kind of interesting. I was looking up some stuff today, trying to find some stuff that would just really wow you about circumcisions and so forth. And there was so much material there that just went all over everywhere. So didn't get into a whole lot of it, but it's interesting that today there is a market for foreskins. Okay, you heard it here first, folks. There is a market for that, especially. Okay, I got my wife's attention over there. So, especially for newborns. And what they do is they take the genetic material from the foreskin for the newborns, and they can make enough they use it for making artificial skin, for skin grafts for burn victims and other kind of deals where they need a skin graft. And so they can take they can make enough out of just one foreskin. They can make like 225,000 square inches of genetic, enough genetic material to make 225,000 artificial skin stuff somehow, and they'll take that because the genetics of the foreskin is still growing and so forth. So anyhow, I thought that was kind of interesting. Totally has nothing to do with the lesson, but it was interesting. Yeah, what I was really trying to do is try to find out, okay, how much would one of those things weigh and how big? And so then calculate how many people there were. Well, we know that there was like 40,000 from the 2.5 tribes that stayed over on the other side of the river. And then, so, easily, maybe they had a 1,000,000-man army. Well, if they had a 1,000,000-man army, and okay, how many of those little things, just really studied it and tried to come up with everything, but there was, I don't know, it just too difficult and too many assumptions. And as hard as I might, I couldn't come up with any real good puns out of it either. So we'll just go on. Now for verses 4 and 5, unless somebody's got a comment. Verses 4 and 5. Now this is the reason why Joshua circumcised all the people that came out of Egypt, who were males. All the men of war had died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. Though all of the people that came out were circumcised, none of the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as it came out of Egypt had been circumcised. So, he's got a statement here that says that before the Israelites left Egypt, all the males were circumcised. Now, some very smart guys think that all those who were born during their encampment at Sinai were also circumcised. We don't know. Also, because they were because there at Sinai they celebrated the Passover. After that time, during their entire stay in the wilderness, no one circumcised their kids, their boys, until they entered into the promised land. And again, it was speculation as to why this was, but basically it was just because of their travels. They never were in the same spot and so forth, which, yeah, maybe so, maybe not, because they did travel a little bit, but at the same time, the children of Israel, they lived in cities in some cases, and they were in and out of Kadesh Barnea all the time, and so they weren't like somebody like going from 1,000 trails or one campground to the next, every 2 or 3 days. No, they only like moved 38 times in the 40 years. So anyhow, that was kind of one of those deals that when you start thinking about it a little bit, you end up with more questions than you got answers. So, but it's just kind of interesting. And so these guys, they were circumcised coming out of Egypt, and that leads me to think, okay, were the Hebrews, were they circumcising their boys while they were in Egypt? And it's kind of unclear about that, but it did say that everyone that came out of Egypt was circumcised. So it's one of two things: either they had been circumcised all along on the 8th day, or they had one of those mass circumcision type things beforehand. But the Bible doesn't say anything about that. So we really don't know how that worked out. So, but these guys, they got to the point now they're going into the land, and God says, all the guys should be circumcised, and so that's when they said, okay, and they did the deed, and so let me get over here. So I'm just saying that evidently there was one of two things: either mass circumcision before the Exodus, or that they had been doing them all along. We don't know. And that the men circumcised at Gilgal during the ceremony were younger than 40 years. Okay, because to look at that, the men, when the spies came back and Israel rejected their report, and that God said, okay, you're going to wander around for 40 years. Okay, there were people there that were just under 20 years old, and at that point they would have they would not have had to die in the desert because they were not of military age. And so basically, well, they're not accountable to they're not held accountable for their dumb decisions. And so, but then they spent 40 years in the desert, and so now they're coming up to crossing into Canaan, promised land, and these guys are 60. The maximum would be 60 years old, and so basically everybody from about 40. Well, everybody that was born during the wilderness sojourn were to be they were had been previously uncircumcised, so then now they're catching up to it. So yeah, it would have been quite the ceremony for all of those thousands, tens of thousands of guys. And I don't know, was it I can't even imagine how they did that. And so I think probably what we'll do is we'll just leave it to your imaginations. Okay. So how they did all that kind of stuff. All right. Any comments or questions? If you do, just you know how to unmute yourself over there. All right, so going ahead with chapter verses 6 and 7. For Bnei Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nations, men of war who came out of Egypt died because they had not listened to the voice of Adonai. To them Adonai had sworn that he would never let them see the land which Adonai had sworn to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. But he raised up their children in their place, and Joshua circumcised them, for they were uncircumcised, since they had not been circumcised along the way. Okay, Israel did not circumcise their boys while in the wilderness. And again, we don't really know why that happened, but it's just a case of perhaps they would say, well, the chances of infection are much greater while we're not living in houses and we're living out in these these goat hair tents and that sort of thing. So for whatever reason, whatever they did not have circumcisions for the 40 years in the desert. So let's go ahead. Now this it brings up that this failure of the people, they were sent to go into the wilderness for 40 years, not because of God's unfaithfulness or God's fault, but it was because they were at fault. And so now you're seeing that that entire generation would never get to see the land of milk and honey. All right, now the wording of milk and honey, we've heard that that thing all our lives. That was a common expression used to denote the richness of the pasture land, because if it had lots of milk in it, it would mean that there's a lot of greenery for their dairy goats to graze on, their cattle and so forth. So they would have had lots of milk, and then honey was an expression to denote the overall richness of the ground and how that they could grow great crops and so forth. And so this would have been land for themselves, and they also had to support some support for the priests, for the Kohanim. All right, but this generation that passed away, you'd think, well, how could a whole generation go? And well, God, that was His plan, that they would go, and then the younger generation would pick up the mantle, as it were, and carry it on. All right, get this thing right over here. Okay, Joshua 8 and 9, Joshua 5, 8, 9. Now it came to pass after they had finished circumcising the entire nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they recovered. Then Adonai said to Joshua, "This day I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt in you." Therefore, the name of that place has been called Gilgal to this day. All right, so Israelites, they were camped outside of Jericho. They could see the city walls. You know, they're looking right there. They could see the city walls. And the inhabitants of Jericho could then look out on the Israelites, and they're all turned around. They're circling them, or they're all the way around them. And you know, how much of this stuff did they actually know? Did they know of any of it? All right. Let's no, I lost my place here. So Israelites, it said, came to pass that they finished circumcising the entire nation. They remained in their place until the camp had recovered. Then Adonai said to Joshua, "This day I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." Therefore, the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Now, last week we also learned that Gilgal meant circle, and there were lots of Gilgals. So, be that as it may, this was also called Gilgal. Now, the Israelites were camped outside of Jericho, on the plains of Jericho, it called. So they could see the walls of Jericho out there, and the inhabitants of Jericho could also see the Israelites. And so now, you know, obviously the people of Jericho couldn't see what the Israelites were doing in their tents with their little funny looking knives. And had they known that, they probably would have tried to come out and attack the Israeli troops. And, you know, because, hey, they're kind of incapacitated right then. So the Bible says everyone stayed in their respective places until the Israelite men had healed up. Now, I figured, okay, that would have been a week or so, a week or more. I have no idea. You know, but they said, I was reading a deal where a doctor said that for an adult male, it could take about 3 weeks. You know, having spoken to someone who had that procedure done, who was an adult, he said, yeah, about a week, and that's all it was required. But that's with modern medicine and so forth. So anyway, it was going to take them a while to get back up to full speed. Now, to me, this act of circumcision by Israel was an overwhelming confidence in God and also in Joshua, that, you know, they were literally exposing themselves to defeat by being in this situation where they could not fight back. So now, said that the reproach of Egypt was rolled away. Now, anybody, I've tried looking this up and studying it. What is the reproach of Egypt? And just about everybody that all the different commentators, you know, got, I don't know, 10 or 12 things that I'm reading here. Every one of them had a little bit different idea of what that meant. And it varied from one to the other. So I'm going to list 3 of them here. And there's all sorts of permutations of that, of those 3. So number 1, they're being circumcised. The Israelites being circumcised made them like the uncircumcised Egyptians, and the Hebrews always considered those who were uncircumcised as to be in a state of grossest impurity. So now, being circumcised, that reproach of uncircumcision had been rolled away. Okay, that's one idea, but the problem with that is that um, Egyptians also carried out, or they practiced circumcision. So the idea that Israel was like the Egyptians, being uncircumcised, that was the reproach. It doesn't hold a lot of water. So there's one that I think is probably not the real reason. Number two, the expression probably refers to taunts that were actually uttered by the Egyptians against Israel because of their long wanderings in the desert and their failure to go in, and just like when they left, the Bible says they left Egypt with a high hand. That's kind of like that, and so now these reproaches that they had been wandering around and they didn't know what they were doing, and God wasn't telling them and all that. Those reproaches are now at an end because they had actually entered into Canaan. And so the restoration of the covenant was a pledge from God to accomplish what he had already begun for them. So, and that one kind of sort of makes some sense. Okay. Then the other part of the reproach of Egypt was um, that being bondmen and slaves as they were in Egypt, now having entered into their inheritance, they are free men, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they were heirs unto, and perhaps in the sense of Josephus wrote this, that he says, to give a strong indication of the word Gilgal, which he says signifies liberty, and adds, for having passed the river, they knew they were free from the Egyptians and from troubles in the wilderness. All right, so there's three ideas about what the reproach of Egypt rolled away meant, and some of them are just, I think some of them are better than others, but the Bible does not specifically tell us what is this reproach of Egypt. So I think it's more a combination of maybe 2 and 3 there. All right, any comments, questions? What happened to my drink? Okay, let me read. Oh my goodness. Let me read through this so that those on the phones can hear it. Now Hashem spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai as the first month of the second year after they had come out of Israel. Keep the Passover at its appointed time on the 14th day of this month, and you should keep it at its appointed time according to all its rites and ceremonies you should keep. So Moses told the the children of Israel that they should keep the Passover, and they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that Hashem commanded Moses. So the children of Israel did. And if a stranger dwells among you and would keep Hashem's Passover, he must do so according to the rite of the Passover, and according to its ceremony. You shall have one ordinance, both for the stranger and for the native land. Okay, so what this basically is saying, they had a Passover there at Sinai, but that was the last one. There were no more Passovers until they got to Canaan, and so these guys that already been circumcised, everyone that was there at Mount Sinai had been circumcised, but then or all the Israelites were. There was a big mixed company there with people, people who were not not Jews. The mix. It was kind of a mixed bag, and so at that point they didn't celebrate the Passover, but the Jews did. They were all circumcised. Then we go 40 years later, and basically, I think the goy, the people of the nations have just kind of evaporated, and so now what you've got it distilled down now to Jewish people or Israeli and the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right, so let me go verses 10 through 12. It says, while Bnei Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed Passover on the 14th 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, matzot and roasted grain. Then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten of the produce of the land, and Bnei Israel had manna no longer, but ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan that year. So on the day after Passover, they ate produce of the land, meaning they could go out and get grain, wheat, and so forth. And then the day after that, manna stopped. So that Passover, that first Passover, then in Israel, would, the way I read this, would necessarily require that that they were still eating manna for that Passover. All right, so it just seems to me like it is. So that trying to keep some of these time frames straight is a little bit difficult, but they would have still had manna and made the unleavened bread out of the manna this particular Passover. And then after that, the next day, they ate of the land, the fruit of the land. And then the next day, the manna ceased. So, and so another thing that's kind of crazy here was that these circumcisions occurred like the day after they crossed the river. Well, they crossed the river on the 10th of Nisan, and then they did the circumcision on the next day, and then they say that on the third day is when the procedure is the most sore and painful. So then they're supposed to be doing Passover at this time. So these guys were still in recovery stage. So a couple of things. Maybe they had just a very miraculous, speedy recovery that would not be normal or to that land. The other thing is, it could have been that their healing was supernatural. It was, it was accelerated. Their healing was accelerated. So instead of being 2 to 3 weeks to recover, it was 2 to 3 days and they were recovered. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, and we can only kind of speculate it. I can see it happening both ways. All right. So any comments there, questions? All right, so let's go ahead with the last section of verses. Now it came to pass when Joshua was near Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, there was a man standing in front of him with his sword drawn in his hand. Joshua approached him and said, "Are you with us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "Neither one. Rather, I have come now as the commander of Adonai's army. Then Joshua fell on his face to the ground and worshiped. Then he asked him, what is my Lord saying to his servant? And then the commander of Adonai's army replied to Joshua, take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you are standing is holy. Okay. All right, so they're standing there. Joshua's kind of out there looking over the situation. I don't know. They didn't have binoculars back in those days, so they just had to stand on the mountainside and give one of those things a looking. So anyway, Joshua's out there, and this guy approached him with a sword in hand. It says a man. Now we know later on that it's an angel, but he took on the form of a man. Nothing different. Nothing. He wasn't all big and buff and so forth. We don't think. And so he meets up with this guy. Pete, you got something?
It couldn't have been an angel. Angels never let people worship them. It had to be Yeshua.
That's a point. That's a point. I unless the way it was, I don't know. I'd have to pull it up in another Bible verse.
It was a man. It wasn't Adonai. So
right.
It had to be Yeshua in human form.
Okay.
Had to be.
What we call an epiphany is what that is, but or theophany. It was a theophany.
There you go.
That's the right word, a theophany. Whereas God comes up in a form that we can actually see him and touch him and so forth. And so I thought it was kind of interesting that he would come up to Joshua and say, just kind of stand there with the sword, and Joshua says, "Are you for us or are you against us? Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And I thought this was kind of an interesting take. He said, "Neither one. Rather, I have now come as commander of Adonai's army." All right, so then that kind of tells me, okay, here he is meeting up with this guy. What's the important thing to come out of this? To me, anyway, it's not, is God on my side? I need to look at, am I on God's side? Whatever side he's on, that's the side I want to be on. It's not like, you look at all wars, and they say, well, they try to gin up a little bit of say the sympathy or support or whatever, and it says, well, God is on our side. No, God's on his own side. You better just be on God's side when he's going through. All right. So one of the things that was kind of interesting, you think about, Joshua was scouting this area, and he had never taken a fortified city. All he'd ever done, I mean, he's a fighter and so forth, but all he'd ever done was meet these the other enemy soldiers out on the battlefield, and it was mano a mano, just one sword after another. And so that's all he could do. I mean, that's all he knew. And Israel had no siege equipment. What those things are, these big towers or battering rams or all sorts of things that catapults, and they didn't have any of that. And so then Joshua was met by a man with a drawn sword. So you're thinking Joshua's looking at this guy, and he says, uh-oh, here I am all alone, and I just meet somebody, right there up on the top of this hill. And it's kind of like, to me, it brought up the idea of the, I don't know, just being surrounded by everybody, your enemy is everywhere, and you're looking at kind of like, I think, what is Smedley Butler one time, a Marine Corps guy, that told him, says, Colonel, we're totally surrounded. And he says, great. Then that way we can shoot in every direction. And so, here's Joshua looking out there. He sees this guy, and his first reaction was to what mine would have been. Are you for us, against us? And then the idea was, let's be on God's side, no matter what, whatever it is that he tells us. So his next statement here was very telling, because here's Joshua, the head of, he's got 1 million-man army out there. And so what's his next thing was saying, what is my Lord saying to his servant? He's taking on some of that thing that Moses did, of being humble and being compliant and so forth. So I thought that was really neat, that here he says, no, what do you want me to do? Here I am trying to take charge. Just come tell me what you want me to do. So then the commander of Adonai's army replied to Joshua, says, take your sandal off of your foot, for the place where you're standing is holy. Now, several of the translations says, take your sandal off your foot, and then other translations actually said, take your sandals off your feet. But, for the most part, it just said, take your sandal off your foot. Any ideas as to why that may have been? Why it would have said just a sandal, a single sandal, rather than both? Or is it doesn't matter? Anybody got any ideas? I don't have, I tried to look in that one up and seeing, okay, what did people comment on? And you know what? They just, they couldn't come up. I didn't see anybody that picked up on that idea of one shoe. So, and Richard put on here that that the word there, where worshipped, is bowed and prostrated, the same as Joseph's brothers did to him. And it also could possibly be him bowing down, basically, kind of to a superior officer. Maybe, I don't know. It just I know that the idea that Joshua became very, very compliant and humble to this guy is a good character trait for Joshua, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about it. You're about to take God's people into war, and you turn around and you see this being just standing in front of you with the sword drawn, and you're like, whose side are you on? He's like, I'm the commander of Adonai's army. It's gonna make me pretty much crap in my pants too, pretty much. I'd fall on my face, and
sure.
Humbleness, and it's interesting, and you're probably going to get to this point here in a minute, that he basically said the same thing to Joshua as the encounter with Moshe at the burning bush. And the interesting thing is if you read the account of the burning bush, it says that the angel of the Lord, the messenger of the Lord, appeared to Moshe in the burning bush. That it was actually this same being, and that's where I'm connecting it. This is the same being that appeared to Moshe that's now appearing to Joshua, saying the exact same thing to Joshua that he said to Moshe: take your shoes off, you're standing on holy ground.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point, and that's kind of what Pete was saying too, is that this had to be a theophany rather than an angel or something. Now, a lot of the commentators that I've read here said, although this was Michael, the head of God's army, and especially Michael is the archangel that's in charge of taking care of the Jews. So,
well,
yeah.
I obviously, you're probably gonna get to the point here in the next few verses. Joshua asks him his name, and he says, "Well, why do you ask my name? My name is Wonderful." And that basically points to the fact that this is actually a pre-manifestation of Yeshua, which would be basically a temporary manifestation of Yeshua as he would be manifested and then would go back to the Father before he was permanently born as a human being. So I would agree with Pete on that, as in he is a pre-manifestation of Yeshua before he was born Yeshua. You know what I mean?
Right. And that is true. I mean, that's like when they had the three visitors with Abraham. We mentioned that before. And I had mentioned that to a doctor. He was a conservadox doctor. That God, he says, well, there's only one God. And I said, that's right. But he can manifest himself in many, many different ways. And one of them was, the burning bush, the visitor to Abraham. And we just kept going. And he says, I never thought of it that way. And so because he couldn't, you mentioned Trinity to him, and you better be talking about a river in North Texas, because otherwise he wasn't going to be talking to you about it at all.
Well, my personal stance on the matter. I'm not a big fan of Trinitarian either, but I believe in one God, and of course Yeshua, the Messiah, being his son, manifested from him. But again, that's another topic. That's another discussion.
And it's a very deep one. And people ask me, and I says, I cannot adequately explain it. I'll tell you right now, I can't explain it in my own mind how that works, and I'm certainly not going to be able to convince you of how it is. But there is only one God, and somehow or another, he manifests himself in different ways, even to the point of saying, how did Yeshua the Son pray to God the Father if they're all the same? That's one of those things, because we think inside time and space, and whereas the concept of God as the one God is outside of time and space, something that our mind does not do really well in conceiving. So, and Pat had
Rabbi?
Yes, sir.
My thought on when Yeshua had to pray to the Father, that in my opinion had to do with the probability that he laid aside his godship to be a man until he was crucified.
Mm-hmm.
So he really was a man.
Yeah. Okay. That's perfectly reasonable on that. Now Pat's trying to show me something that on the covenant sandal covenant. We're talking about the covenant, or how that the commander of God's army told him to take your sandal off of your foot, and but basically, they would do contracts back in the day with a sandal. When Abraham bought land, he put down a sandal, and that was their collateral. When Boaz took on Ruth as his wife, he was redeeming her, and he used a sandal for that. So here, it may be a case of where he said, take your sandal off your foot, because where you're standing is holy. And so Joshua did that, and it was a contract then between God and Joshua to say that, okay, now we're renewing our covenant. You guys have done your circumcisions, and now you're in right standing, and here's your sandals. So it could very well have been something like that. That was a good catch on her part. Okay. Hang on. She said that they would actually use those sandals, an old sandal, as part of their a boundary marker to buy the land, and then you'd put rocks on top of it, and then nobody would ever dream of moving those rocks. The Bible was very adamant about that. You don't move boundary markers, and so that's in Deuteronomy 19:14. Okay, so anyway, that's a thought on what that actually meant for that army. Taking the army commander says, take your sandal off, because now we got a contract here. And so anyway, all right, now that's chapter 5, and next week we'll start with the conquest of Jericho. Pete,